Hi everyone, this is the video that goes with chapter 2, the chapter on research methods in psychology. And as we talked about with chapter 1, critical thinking is really important in this course, but also knowing how the research was done and sort of being able to evaluate that as you evaluate the outcomes, so that you have an idea of what they did, how they did it, what they found, and then what your ideas are for how they might have gotten it right or gotten it wrong as you progress through your career. So the first question to ask in psychology is, we're a social science, so what makes something a science? Very often when I go to professional meetings that include people from all over the college or other colleges as well, they'll talk about like who in here is in the hard sciences. And I always take issue with that, not because I have any kind of stake in being a scientist, so to speak. But psychology is a science. Anything that uses the scientific method is a science. So to call something a hard science versus a soft science, I think really misrepresents what a science is. If you use the scientific method, there are things that are being discovered in physics or in chemistry or in biology that negate what we thought before and advance our knowledge in some way. That's the scientific method. We do that in psychology. We do that in anthropology. We do it in sociology. We do it in many areas of academic research. We use the scientific method. So for something to be a science, you use the scientific method. You analyze things in a pretty systematic way. You look at observations. You come up with some findings. You try and figure out what they mean, and then sort of start it all over again. It was like, well, what was left out? How could you clarify that? How could you maybe understand it in a different way, or use that information to understand something else entirely. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be asking and talking about in this chapter. In class, if we were doing this in person in class, I have a whole list of questions that I would ask everyone to respond to. So I'm going to put them up fairly quickly. The type is pretty small for something that would be viewed on a screen on a phone or on a computer. So I'm not expecting you to know the answers to these questions, but I just wanted to bring up a couple of them. So when you ask, can science answer a question, there are certain questions that science can answer and some that it can't. So is capital punishment, the death penalty, bad for society? Do people talk more after they have eaten than they do when they're hungry? So some of these are something that you could actually study. How much they talk, whether or not they've just eaten or not, whether they're hungry or not. Those are things that you can measure. Capital punishment, we know what that is. Bad for society, though. That's a hard thing to quantify or to come up with some sort of an operational definition that everyone could agree on. So I would say that question 1 probably is not a good candidate for science. Question 2 is. The third one, does jogging lead to a positive mental attitude? We can study that, right? We can have people jog or not jog. We can measure their outlook on life, or any number of ways we can measure mental attitudes, and then see whether the people that were in the jogging group seemed to be different in some way than people who were in the non-jogging group. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in this semester, or also in this semester, but definitely in this chapter, about how we can operationalize things and how we can make a study out of it and come up with some findings. So I'm going to skip past the rest of the questions. We may have time to talk about them in person sometime, but definitely not in this video. Having said that, if you wanted to pause the video or go back just a little bit and freeze the video, you can read the questions. So the goals of science are, first and foremost, measurement and description. We have to be able to measure something, and we want to describe what's happening. If we're interested in studying depression, if we're interested in studying the things that motivate people, we need to describe what it is that we're trying to measure and come up with some measurement techniques for it. That will help us understand it better. That will help us, once we have the information, predict what people would do in a similar situation. So if we've done a study and we've been able to identify those kinds of things, then we want to be able to predict behavior, and in some cases intervene, right? If it's something that we'd like less of, perhaps depression, what can we do about it? If there's something that we would like more of, say extroversion or creativity, then what are the things that are associated with more of that, and how can we do more of that? So we want to form hypotheses. We have a hypothesis that says, I think the following things might increase creativity. I can test that. And so my hypothesis is, if you do these things, you will become more creative. Now, I'm going to need a measure of creativity, and not everybody's going to agree on it, but perhaps I can come up with one, or you can come up with one. The variables that we use, that we measure, how do we measure creativity? How do we measure the different aspects of it within our study? Those will be the variables that we measure. The overarching theory is a theory that says creativity is learned, perhaps, or creativity is something that can be fostered in people. And we may have a theory based on evidence so far that suggests that that can be the case. Now, when I was younger, I thought that people were either creative or not. I didn't think of myself as particularly creative, and I thought that the people around me who were creative were just sort of born that way. And it wasn't until I was an adult and studying psychology that I understood that creativity can be taught, creativity can be learned, and it can be enhanced with certain interventions or certain methodology. And so that overarching theory about the fact that creativity is malleable is a theory, and then a specific hypothesis. If you do these things, the impact on creativity will be X or Y. That would be the hypothesis. One of my, it's not really a pet peeve, but sometimes if you hear somebody say, I've got a theory about that, very often the next thing out of their mouth is a hypothesis. They might say, I have a theory that the following kinds of people are the worst drivers. Well, that's a hypothesis. You can test that. That's not a full-on theory. So the difference between a theory and a hypothesis is that the theory is the overarching understanding of how things work at a more global level, and a hypothesis is something that could actually be tested. So steps in a scientific investigation: formulate a hypothesis, select some sort of a research method, and we're about to talk about research methods. Collect data in a scientific way, in a responsible way, in a replicable way, something that somebody else could do it again and get the same answer, or at least try to. Analyze your data once you've got it, draw some conclusions, and then report the findings. It's really important to report the findings, even if they didn't support your hypothesis. If you thought that one group of people were the best drivers and it turned out that they weren't, you should also publish that, because even though you were wrong about it, you have some information now about that could help people who also share that view and who are also perhaps wrong. And so it can be important to publish what we would call null findings. When you don't find what you're looking for, that's important too. So scientific approach is really important. It gives us clarity. You can understand based on the information that's presented in the book. When you get to some of the subsequent chapters on the brain or personality or development or sensation and perception, you'll be able to see how they gathered the data, or you could if you looked up their references. We don't want a lot of error, and so it's really important that publications and that research goes through a review process where people who have already been working in the field review it and say, we think that your methodology seems sound. Go ahead and collect the data. Or your methodology seems sort of messy. I don't know about you, but I've taken questionnaires before, and I'm like, who wrote this? I don't even know what this question means, and I'm pretty sure that this question doesn't mean the same thing to me that it does to the person to my right and to my left if it's poorly written. And so it's really important to be really precise in the way that you ask questions or measure data, and that you don't have a lot of errors built into it. Because if you've got a lot of error, then nobody really knows what you found. And different research methods. There is no one right research method. Just like there's no one right theory of everything in psychology, there's certain theories that explain some things better, and they don't explain other things at all. There are other theories that explain those things, but not this first thing. That's true also with research methods. It depends on what you're asking, and it depends on what you're studying, which research method will be the best for your study. And it's important, if you go on and take more psychology, perhaps major in psychology or get a graduate degree in psychology, you will take entire semester-long courses on research methods. I took courses on how to write good survey questions, all kinds of different ways, because collecting the data can be almost as important as the data itself, because without precision, you really don't have anything at all. So common sense. In psychology, a lot of times you'll be reading along in the book and you'll say, well, I already knew that. You'll read some finding or some fact, and it was like, why do I have to study psychology? I already knew that. My mother could have told you that. My grandmother could have told you that. And that might be true, but your grandmother and my grandmother might have had a different idea. Your mother and you and my mother might have had a different idea. You and I might have different ideas about what is quote unquote common sense. So Psychology is taking things that we might think are obvious and actually studying them to make sure that they are what we think they are. So here's a question for you. If you were to fold a piece of paper 1/10 of a millimeter thick, so really thin, you fold that piece of paper 100 times. Okay, so I don't have a big piece of paper in front of me. I've got a small Post-it. I fold it in half once, and that's one time. Then the next time I fold it in half again, and then I fold it half again. Now, at some point it becomes a thought experiment because you can see that I can't literally fold this 100 times. But if I could, how thick would it be? And so that's a question for you. I'm not going to give it away, but I'd be interested in what you think the answer is without looking it up, and sort of see what would your common sense tell you, and just sort of write something down. You know, as we're going through these slides, or as I'm going through these slides, as you're listening. Write things down. Write down what some of your answers to these questions might be, so that you can sort of think about whether you were correct or not and why. Okay, so looking for causes. Experimental research, a lot of research in psychology is what we would call quasi-experimental. And the reason for that is if you want to design an experiment, you need a control group and you need an experimental group. Your control group might do nothing, and your experimental group might do whatever it is that you think will impact the results of your study. And then you look at the impact at the end and you say, are those two groups different? So if you think that a certain, say, assigning people to have a certain number of tutoring sessions at the tutoring center at Wake Tech would improve their overall grades, then you could have a control group who were asked to do something, but it had nothing to do with tutoring, and another group, an experimental group, who were asked to engage in, say, 18 or 12 or 6 sessions with somebody in the tutoring center. And then at the end of the semester, you could compare the grades of those two groups. Now, if you've randomly, one of the things that's really important in psychology in any field, in an experiment, is that there's random assignment to groups. So what you need to do is randomly assign every other person to either be a control or an experimental group participant. And the reason for that is some students are already going to have higher grades or lower grades, and you don't want to get a bunch of them in one of these groups because then you don't really know whether the tutoring center was the thing that impacted it. So for example, if you took, say you were going to do it with 36 students in a psychology class, and you assigned the first 18 people that walked into the room to be in one of the groups and the last 18 to be in the other group, it's possible, it doesn't mean that it's true for everybody, but it's possible that there are already average grade differences between people who come to school or come to class early and people who end up being late. Now, there are a lot of factors that can influence that on any given day, but overall, you might be able to say, well, people who have the ability to get to school earlier may have more time on their hands, they may study more, they may do a number of things, and people who don't may have a busier schedule, they may have a lot more on their plate, and they may be less able to study for as long or efficiently or whatever it is. So it would be important to take every other person so that there's some of both in each group, and the overall outcome, if it's different, couldn't just be because of something that they had, some quality that they had walking into the experiment. So random assignment is really important. There are two terms in your book, random assignment and random sampling. I've just described random assignment to groups, and that's what makes something a true experiment. Now, one of the problems in psychology is for a lot of what we study, we cannot randomly assign people to groups. I cannot randomly assign you to be abused as a child and then see what your attachment pattern will be in adulthood. I cannot randomly assign you to be male or female and then see how you would approach problem solving or a spatial question or literature or something. So I can't really do that. What I can do, though, is I can do a quasi-experiment, and I can say, okay, I have a group of people who identify as male, a group of people who identify as female, and then I randomly assign them to be in an experimental group or a control group. That's the best that I can do, and then I can analyze the data based on that. So we don't, that's one of the reasons why we don't use the word prove as often in psychology, because we can't truly randomly assign people to groups for all of the variables of interest that we think might be influencing that outcome that we were looking for, that we were studying. So there's